So the idea behind the accelerated approval pathway is that it's a compromise that's intended to allow products to come on the market more quickly before we are totally confident that they are effective. And then the compromise part of it is early access and then later confirmation of benefit. So when a product gets FDA approval, it has to be demonstrated safe and effective. That requirement stands for the accelerated approval pathway as well. But rather than relying on measures of how patients feel, function, or survive, those clinical endpoints that really matter to patients, accelerated approval can be based on surrogate markers that are predicted to demonstrate clinical benefit, but not yet proven to do so. So it might be something, a biomarker, it might be some level of protein in the blood or some result on a scan that is not a direct measure of how the patient feels, functions, or survives, but gives some signal, we hope. But because it's not a proven surrogate measure, the requirement is for companies to continue studying their accelerated approval drugs after they're approved for marketing to get confirmation of benefit. Now, we'll talk a lot more about this. If a company fails to do its confirmatory studies with due diligence, or the results of those studies fail to confirm benefit, the accelerated approval pathway also offers the possibility of an expedited withdrawal process so that FDA could pull back that accelerated approval.
Perfect. And I know you've both written about some of the problems with this pathway. If we were here as just big cheerleaders, I don't think that would be all that interesting. Erin, you've written a lot about some of the problems, but let's start with the win. I mean, tell people how this, maybe the first example of how this pathway came about. I think it's famous and known to some of us, but not to everyone, or maybe other examples where you think this process actually worked.
Well, I think there are actually a lot of good examples where the pathway works. The pathway was originally created after the HIV epidemic in the 1980s as a way of trying to expedite availability of drugs that would, reduce the amount of HIV in the blood. But we didn't know yet whether or not they actually helped people with HIV live longer. And so, in that context, it made sense to allow these drugs, and the risk, was worth it, so to speak, to allow these drugs on the market sooner when all we knew was their effect on the surrogate measure rather than their effect on the ultimate clinical endpoint of the patient. And so, for a lot of those early HIV medications, that it did end up turning out that in subsequent studies, if you reduce HIV virus in the blood, that you reduce patients' morbidity and mortality with the disease. And, then subsequent to that, it was applied much more commonly among cancer, where, in some cancers, if you did not show progression of the cancer on the new drug, that it would be presumed that would mean you would live longer. And then there are some really good examples, like Gleevec is a really good example of a drug where the drug showed major improvement for patients who didn't have any other treatments available to them, and those were subsequently shown to actually translate to extending patients' lives. So there are a lot of good examples out there of drugs approved through this pathway that that end up turning out to be transformative products that really have a lot of important for the care of patients.
One thing that I think is interesting to think about is the kind of scale of conditions that we're considering. On one hand, you mentioned the first one, the AZT for HIV/AIDS, and this was something that you had thousands and thousands of people dying a year for want of anything that worked. And then on the other side of the coin, this pathway is often used almost for the exact opposite situation, which is that these are rare diseases in which a large clinical trial really isn't practical. It's hard to control. Is that a problem, Holly, just in terms of the quality of evidence that we're relying on? Because it's easy to run a trial and just expedite it when you've got a denominator of 1 million people, but with a really small population, is it problematic to rely on this kind of a thing?
You know, I'm not sure that the size of the patient population is especially more challenging for the accelerated approval pathway versus the traditional approval pathway. I mean, the challenges that you're describing, you know, small patient populations, not enough really to kind of have the statistical power that you might be looking for. That would apply regardless of the endpoints that you're looking at. The difficulty is that when we're dealing with these unproven surrogates, and small patient populations, it's kind of a double whammy of uncertainty, right? So you have, you know, low powered studies, and you have endpoints that we're not totally confident about, right? So we may be making, you know, additional trade-offs in those domains, but they could be reasonable trade-offs. I mean, the main issue with, well, I would say two main issues with accelerated approval. One, you know, we are not going to be looking for perfect endpoints. If they were perfect, then we would be relying on traditional approval. But do we have some reasonable confidence in the surrogates that are being used for accelerated approval on the front end? And then the other challenge is on the back end, making sure that those confirmatory studies are well designed and completed in an appropriate time frame. That time frame is going to be different depending on how large the patient population is, right? So again, if you have a very rare disease, you might need more time to do your follow-up, your confirmatory studies. But just kind of recognizing that this is a trade-off, right? When we're having kind of lower quality evidence on the front end, we have to be really vigilant to make sure we are getting that confirmatory evidence on the back end.
Can we pick up the confirmatory trial piece right there? Because that is such an important part of this, right? So the idea of the pathway, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that the FDA will accept something on the basis of something other than a clinical outcome, a biomarker, some proxy, a surrogate endpoint is the official kind of terminology. But then at the same time, the companies are required to eventually show some kind of clinical benefit, ideally in a randomized trial, although not always. Can we talk a little bit about the problem of that part of it, the confirmatory trials? And I believe the federal government itself said, look, we've got something like 34% of drugs that have gone through this pathway whose confirmatory clinical trials haven't even been completed on time, let alone some that were done and had to be withdrawn. So can you talk a little bit about where things stand on the confirmatory trial piece?
Sure, I can jump in. So yeah, as you said, that, you know, part of the accelerated approval quid pro quo is that, you know, let drugs get on the market quicker based on changes to surrogate measures that are not well validated, in exchange for the conduct of a confirmatory study that goes on while the drug is on the market and is being made available to patients. I think the two major issues with those are that those confirmatory trials can take a long time. Sometimes they take longer than what the FDA expected, in which case, as you point out, they can be delayed. And then the other question is what those confirmatory trials do. And unfortunately, what we found in prior research in our group is that some of these confirmatory trials don't actually test clinical measures. They continue to test surrogate measures. And then even more importantly, some of these confirmatory trials turn out to be negative, and then nothing happens. And the drug isn't immediate, isn't then the indication then isn't taken off of the drug labeling or some other action taken. And so you know, all of those things you know are where this kind of quid pro quo confirmatory trial conduct issue runs into trouble. So I think that you know, generally speaking, it might make sense to allow faster access to some of these products on the basis of uncertain evidence if there was if everybody, you know, knew that there was going to be a follow-up study coming along relatively soon that was actually tested actual meaningful endpoints and that was going to be acted on, where if it's positive, you know, then the you know, the information would be integrated into the labeling and patients could continue to use it. Or if it's negative, then the approval of the drug for that use could be re-examined. And so I think on all of those points, there has been some, you know, suboptimal outcomes the last few years.
Is there a shot clock thing happening here, Holly, where the companies are dragging their feet, knowing that, look, they've got a patent for a certain amount of time and they just want to maximize, you know, market penetration as much as they can, and if they kind of drag their feet on the confirmation trial, then even if eventually it doesn't work out, they got most of their upside by just having it out there before the trial actually got done?
Yeah, so I think that there's an incentive challenge here, right? So once a product gets accelerated approval, it's on the market. Companies can charge whatever they want, and in most cases, payers will pay it, right? They're, depending on who the payer is, right? But that's a key incentive. If the product is already approved and you're profiting at kind of the maximal level, really completion of the confirmatory trial does not stand to benefit the sponsor, right? At best, it confirms benefit, and then that maintains the status quo, right? At worst, it will damage, right, what the company was pursuing and show, oh, this product doesn't actually work. So why would we move quickly to show that the drug doesn't actually work? And similarly, maybe it will be ambivalent, right? The results will be ambiguous, right? That also, right, could only be kind of a downside for the company. So if you just kind of think objectively about the incentive structure for companies to pursue these on time, they don't have much kind of internal incentive. Now, I don't mean to paint them all as, bad guys, right? Presumably, right? They're hoping that their products are truly beneficial, but from an economic perspective, the incentives are misaligned. So how could you address that incentive? Well, FDA could really hold companies' feet to the fire to say, this is your deadline, you fail to meet your deadline, or the product does not actually confirm benefit, we're going to yank approval, right? That would be a way to actually push companies to do these studies on time. But for a variety of reasons, in the past, FDA has not always been willing or able to kind of put pressure on companies, and that's often because it's hard to get the genie back in the bottle. Once a product is on the market for one of these conditions, right, that accelerated approval can only be used for serious or life-threatening diseases and conditions with unmet treatment needs. So if nothing better has come along in the meantime, right, you're going to have patients and clinicians who say, this drug seems to be having an impact on my patient, or maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but we don't have anything better, right? And so then that can create pressure on FDA to leave these products that are kind of lingering on the market, right? We see, some pushback in that regard. And then the last challenge in terms of incentives is you need patients to be willing to participate in confirmatory studies. But participating in a well-designed, rigorous, randomized controlled trial can be burdensome for patients. So if I am a patient in need and I have an accelerated approval drug that's on the market, my choice is maybe I can get my doctor to prescribe this and my insurance company to pay. That seems like the path of least resistance. Why am I going to enroll in a study, right, and have additional visits and all the rigmarole that comes along with that? So that creates another incentive structure challenge. To the extent that we could help patients understand that there is residual uncertainty about these products, that might help. On the other hand, right, again, if there's nothing better, maybe that uncertainty wouldn't actually change people's minds and they'd still rather just take the approved drug. So we kind of have this like trifecta of concerns in terms of incentives for patients, sponsors, and FDA that make it difficult to collect data that we need on the post-approval side.